Well, I really appreciate my colleague, Mr. Gomer, once again for yielding time on so many of these important topics that we've worked on together during my relatively short time here. This, of course, is very key to all of us in the West, and the reality of which needs to be impressed upon all the people of the country and all of our legislative colleagues across the country, especially on the East Coast, that really can't quite fathom how far-reaching this is in Western states. So it's really a pleasure to be able to join with my other Western colleagues and Mr. Gomer that have spoken here tonight. So, because we need to raise the awareness of yet another new map being released by the Natural Resources Committee. Now, the map I'm illustrating here, this actually breaks it down into a smaller size. This is the 1st Congressional District of California. This being Oregon up top and Nevada on the side. We have that top corner there, which is part of a state that is owned approximately 45% by the federal government. Actually, not by the federal government, it belongs to the people. It's the public's land. And our neighboring state, Nevada, approximately 84% federal land. So we know how poorly they're managed as we watch them go up in flames each summer. The visible result is that millions of acres in the West burn each year. As the amount of timber and fuel reduction work is done, you see most of that is done on private lands where they can actually go out, have the incentive to take care of their assets, versus the other side with U.S. Forest Service, BLM, and others that don't seem to be able to get out of their own tracks on the issue. For example, last year, 576,000 acres of federal land burned in California. This is the public's land, about 1.3% of all federal land in the state. Even worse, fires which began on national forest lands burned hundreds of thousands of acres of private and state land as well, where, as part of the strategy, the federal government was even resorting to a backfire setting strategy on private lands, as they're doing right now, to let it burn its way out. This happening partly up in my district in Siskiyou County right now. Thousands of acres of land backfired. We know that the Forest Service and National Park Service alone have a deferred maintenance backlog of by their own estimate of over $16 billion. $16 billion that would have to come from the National Treasury. Yet both agencies are continually attempting to acquire even more land. The result, of course, is that these agencies' funds are stretched more and more thinly, making the backlog even worse. At the same time, they're also complaining that with the increased amount of fire suppression, the costs have shifted for Forest Service from 1/3 of their budget just a few years ago to now 2/3 of their entire budget is for fire suppression, making it harder for the things they should be doing with getting out harvest permits and doing their other green work during the non-fire season that doesn't happen anymore. Another impact of federal land acquisition is to deny the local governments the property tax revenue they would receive and generate, and deny the rural communities the jobs and economic activity that responsible timber, ranching, farming, and mining operations would generate. Federal land acquisition, thanks to it, and this administration's refusal to properly manage national forests, rural communities are heavily reliant on the Secure Rural Schools Fund, a program the federal government funds to help local schools, police, and local infrastructure to the tune of about $285 million last year. Counties are also heavily reliant on the PILT fund, payment in lieu of taxes, to the tune of about $450 million last year. In both cases, local governments have less funding than if they're simply allowed to have the functioning economies that federal regulations have destroyed. Both of these funds are something we have to fight for each budget year to make sure they stay in place, because people seem to forget these are backfills for what has been taken away from rural communities and rural economies. These rural economies, they don't want handouts. They want to have the opportunity to be self-sufficient without having to come begging for the PILT fund and the Secure Rural Schools Fund. Jobs for these economies, for these local areas, versus high unemployment and the social ills that come from an economy that has now disappeared, the social ills that affect families, that affect homes, that affect local government, and what you have now with the issues of people that are now basically in depression, more domestic violence that happens because they don't have a job anymore. However, the federal footprint isn't limited solely to federally owned land. The map identifies not just land owned by the federal government, but also areas with restrictions on human activities due to federal regulations. As you can see, between national forests and other federal public lands and areas under critical habitat, wetlands, or other restrictions, economic activity is restricted in the vast majority of my district. These colors in green and this orange are pretty much dominated by federal land ownership or supposedly stewardship. The areas in white are where the options are still for people in private areas to carry out economic activity. You can see from the color of that map that there's not a whole lot of options left. Indeed, by the time they establish wildlife corridors and more of these things that are in the plans, then you can see our options are going to be just about zero. So this means that local voices, once again, ignored. Communities have little recourse when federal agencies arbitrarily decide to close roads, limit economic activities, hunting, fishing, hiking, what have you, and expand their reach through regulations and habitat designations. Rural Sierra Nevada communities have long been told by environmentalists that they must shift to a tourism economy, now that federal and state restrictions have nearly killed the timber and mining industries in those areas. But what happens when the same environmental agenda, extended in the form of critical habitat and other designations, even damages the fledgling tourist economy that they want to promote for these communities? The Fish and Wildlife Service recently bent to the demands of extremist groups and listed the Sierra Nevada yellow-legged frog and the Yosemite toad under the Endangered Species Act, affecting much of this area on the east side in my district and extending down into Mr. McClintock's district south of mine there. During this process, my colleagues heard from many people in the several public meetings that I had and Mr. McClintock had on this very subject a couple of years ago. He wanted the public to be able to be part of this process to ensure that the service heard the concerns of our constituents directly. The service's initial habitat maps were riddled with obvious errors like the inclusion of parking lots and other areas which contained zero amphibian habitat. And over 20,000 public comments were submitted, which are overwhelmingly opposed to the designation of this new so-called critical habitat. However, when the final designations were released just a few days ago, they differed little from the initial maps. Nearly 2 million acres of Sierra Nevada, all down the east side of California, about half within my district, the other half pretty much all within Mr. McClintock's district, were designated as critical habitat. Again, throughout this process, the Fish and Wildlife Service claimed there would be no negative impacts to Sierra communities. We learned that claim to be false almost immediately. For years, a race called the Lost Sierra Endurance Run, a 50-kilometer race, has been held on existing trails and roads throughout the town of Gray Eagle area of Plumas County, California. Run by a local small local nonprofit, the race generates thousands of dollars for trail maintenance, has a significant economic impact on a little town known as Gray Eagle. With local hotels, restaurants, and shops benefiting from the visitors the race draws to the area, as well as people being able to enjoy the outdoors and see what their public lands are all about. However, last year, before the critical habitat designation was even complete, the nonprofit was told they need to pay to conduct a study on the impacts of the race, on the yellow-legged frog, an impact study. Federal agencies were concerned that runners using existing trails might negatively impact the frogs. The study the federal agents demanded was costly enough to more than wipe out any proceeds from the race, and the organizers were forced to cancel it. Not only will runners not be visiting the area, but now trail conditions will deteriorate without the funding the race generated. Yeah, the funding was there that the race generated was there to make the habitat and make the trails be maintained. This is the second year that the race has not occurred, and it's likely that with the visitors it brought to the area, that it's gone permanently. What's next? Limits on walking through the area within critical habitat? Colleagues, it may sound absurd, but federal agencies have already expressed concern that running within this designation could harm frogs. Imagine all the other activities, using off-road vehicles, hunting, fishing, camping, bird watching, hiking, that agencies likely view as dangerous to frogs. As we watch the West burn this time of year, we observe the failure of federal ownership and non-management of the public's lands. Compare private timberlands versus the public. Private is fire resistant and healthy by and large, where they're able to manage their own lands. You can fly over it and see the checkerboard pattern of public versus private. Either before a fire, you see it being managed. After a fire, you see the private lands where they go back out there and get the lands recovered and replanted again. Public land sits there with a bunch of snags, dead timber, brush growth. Comes the next tinderbox in 5 or 7 years. Indeed, the damage from these massive fires we have these days, these catastrophic fires, isn't just to the trees. It's to the habitat, to the wildlife, the very habitat they're fighting for, fighting against us on. When you have these devastating fires, the next winter, what do you get? Ash, silt, all washing down into the creeks, the streams, the rivers, the lakes, making it bad for the fish, and you don't have the habitat there for your owls, for anything else that used to be there when the forest was still standing. Somehow there's a handful of extremists think this is somehow good. Oh, we need these burned lands. California is full, at this point, about 66 million dead trees by the U.S. Forest Service own estimates. And this isn't just an isolated tree here and there. Now you can see entire groves of trees that are just waiting for the next lightning strike or the next spark. And it's going to be big-time problems for those areas to try and put them out. Forest Service even goes so far to resist the opportunity for doing land swaps with the lands that's already been managed, thinned, properly left by private concerns, where they can then move on to take some trails into public ownership that would be beneficial for the public as well as private entities being able to manage that formerly public land. They resist these kinds of swaps because they want to buy more, acquire more, with money we don't have. Each new national monument, wilderness, critical habitat designation, or study area limits the tools to promote healthy forests. With the desire and even mandate for new renewable electricity, especially the mandates in California, forest biomass is one of the greatest opportunity potentials we have, and something we need to be doing yesterday in order to generate the electricity with that product and bring the jobs that would moving that extra material in a well-managed in a way that is good for the ecology for that forest, bring those jobs right in the district, not building solar cells in China or wind machines in Europe, but jobs right in our own backyard, thinning these forests, using the material, and putting it into a power plant that could generate renewable electricity to meet the mandate of 50% California sees and other states will probably start adopting. We can be putting these jobs back home, improving forest safety from fire safety, preserving the habitat, keeping the water quality up, and yeah, bringing the jobs home for those paper and wood products that we still all need. Instead, we watch them burn because they're unwilling to do what needs to be done. They're afraid to do what needs to be done. And there's not enough money in the U.S. Treasury to go out and try and recover all that habitat, plant those forests back as what the private sector could be doing when it manages it and is allowed to make just a little bit of a living at a time. So we got a lot of work to do in getting this message across, and the way the West is dominated by poor management from the federal level. And so I hope those people listening here tonight will take this to heart and give us the backing we need to accomplish better policy goals and make it where our Western lands, our Western economies, our Western habitats could actually be preserved with wise management, not this debacle we see happening every fire season. So again, to my colleague, Mr. Gohmert, thank you so much for having this time here tonight for us to be able to spotlight this once again for the American people and for our colleagues.